Hello everyone, this is Contra Orientalis. Today we will be going over the unity of China and the concept on a historic level. Now, if you're somebody who has a casual interest and understanding of China, something that you may see often talked about is the idea that China must be unified or how it's natural for China to be unified. This is something you can see when it comes to people talking about both modern day China and the possibility of its separation, but also something brought up when talking about China on a historic level. Often, the idea of how China must be unified is brought up for the reason why various Chinese empires warred and conquered in order to unify the imperial state. A somewhat deterministic view is put forward to the concept of China as a unified entity. Now, there are a couple of reasons that people give for why China must be unified. One we'll be only skimming through in this video is the geographic arguments. China's natural geography is what shaped the borders of China. Throughout its history, China's unity has been caused due to the geography of the state. Now, this is problematic for a couple of reasons. First of all, the borders of China has varied throughout history. Secondly, geography does not play a determining role in the borders of a state. While the borders of a country are influenced by its geography, the geography does not determine this. Just to give one example of this, let's look at the state of Ireland. The island of Ireland is a medium-sized island. Its geography does not place any difficulties in terms of traveling outside of a couple small hills and mountains. And yet, through most of its history, Ireland has been divided into various clans and small kingdoms. Even today, in the modern state of Ireland, due to political history and ideology, Ireland is divided between Northern Ireland, ruled over by the United Kingdom, and the rest of the island. Similarly, when we look at France, while we can see how France's geography has helped to shape the country, when we look at the northeast of the country, if we were to just look on a geographic deterministic route, then the Benelux is a natural part of France. In fact, when we look throughout France's history, we can see the concept of the France at its natural borders, which often included the Low Countries. And yet, for most of French histories, many of these territories have lied long outside of its border. Now, when we go back to China, while it is true that its geography does help to benefit its expansion, we also see when we examine things on a more detailed level, things like the Tibetan mountains and the Gobi Desert would actually hinder its expansion in those areas. And yet, historically, China has been able to rule past the Gobi Desert and rule over varying parts of Tibet. Now, moving past the geography of China, which is something we'll be going back into a later video, looking at things on a historic level, let's examine the history of China and the history of its unity and see what we can learn from this. Now, we'll be mostly focusing on the imperial history of China. When we look at its imperial history, there have been 8 dynasties to actually unify China. We have the Qin dynasty, the Han, the Jin, the Sui, the Song, Yuan, Ming, and Qing. Now, before somebody jumps into the comment section, yes, I did not include the Jin, Tang, or Zhao dynasty, and this is purposeful. While these dynasties did rule over a unified China, these dynasties did not unify China per se, but rather came about by the overthrow of previous dynasties. In the case of the Tang, which we will be addressing, they came about after the overthrow of the Sui dynasty, which is the one that actually unified China during that period. Now, outside of these unification periods, China has had many kingdoms and empires lay claim to its territories through its history. Now, looking at things from this point of view, we could make the argument that our concept of modern China has influenced our idea of the historical emphasis on China's unity. If China had currently been separated, someone could very well make the argument that China should be separated when looking at how long throughout its history the Chinese states spent divided. Now, let's go chronologically through the various dynasties that ruled over China, starting, of course, with the Qin dynasty. Now, the Qin dynasty was actually very short lived, lasting only about 14 years. Yet, during those periods, it played an important role in the concept and foundation of China. Even the name of China in English and many other languages, such as French, comes from the name of the Qin. This Qin dynasty would originate from the Qin state during the pre-imperial period known as the Warring States period. After lengthy conquest and consolidation under a legalist philosophy, King Yingzheng of the Qin state would establish the first imperial government and proclaim himself Huangdi, a title originating with him and that from then on would signify the Emperor of China. From this point, we see the Qin expansion south to rule over much of what would become seen as the core of China, what is known by some as China proper. He himself would later become known as Shi Huangdi, meaning the first emperor. After its short-lived success and the death of his first ruler, the Qing dynasty would fall and lead to the period known as the 18 Kingdoms. Two of the most important kingdoms during this time would be the Han and the Chu, and after the conquest of the varying other kingdoms, they would be the last two left, and for a period you would have what was known as the Chu-Han contention. In the end, however, the Han would reign supreme and unify all of China under its control. Now, after this unification of China, the Han dynasty would go on to expand, unifying all the territories that had been previously under the Qin. They would actually expand their borders farther, and much more of what we know today as being China would come onto the Han dynasty. Now, the Han Dynasty would play a very important role in the history of China. The Han Dynasty would last for about 500 years, and during that time, it would play a very important role into the culture and ethnogenesis of the Chinese people. Even the name of the Han ethnicity, the largest ethnicity in China, actually stems from the name of the Han Dynasty. The Han Dynasty would play a very important part into the culture of China. If you're someone very interested in Chinese media, the stories of the Han Dynasty, at the very minimum its fall, is probably known to you. The fall of the Han Dynasty would give way to the Three Kingdoms period, a very popular period in a lot of Chinese media, including books, shows, movies, and games. Now, after a period of corruption, political instability, and rebellions, the Han Dynasty would collapse, and we would see the consolidation of China under three kingdoms during the Three Kingdoms period. The Three Kingdom period would last for about 60 years before the unification of China once more under the Jin Dynasty. Now, the Jin Dynasty would last for about 115 years, but the unification of China itself would only last for about 24 of those years. This would put the unification under the Jin lasting longer than the time of the Qin Dynasty, but not lasting longer than the Three Kingdoms period that had directly preceded it. After the fall of the Jin Dynasty, we would see the rise of the 16th Kingdom period. The 16th Kingdom period would last for about 135 years. After the end of this period, however, we would not see the unification of China. Rather, we would see the consolidation of the North and South into separate dynasties. This period of the Northern and Southern dynasty would last almost 200 years, as the North and South would go their separate ways. Finally, however, the unification of China would come under the Sui dynasty. Now, the Sui dynasty would be very important to the history of China, having unified China after its division for almost 300 years. The Sui dynasty would spend costly campaigns in order to conquer the various dynasties that had ruled over China up until that point. However, the Sui dynasty would not last long. After a period of instability and disastrous wars, there would be a political overthrow and the establishment of the Tang dynasty. Now, the Tang dynasty is probably the second most important dynasty that we've reached up until this point. The Tang would rule China longer than all dynasties except for the Han, and it would be the largest dynasty up until this point and the largest native Han dynasty of all time. In terms of longevity, they would not be eclipsed until the time of the Ming dynasties. However, unfortunately for the Tang, all empires eventually come to an end. The Tang would lose control over China, and this would lead to the five dynasties and 10 kingdom periods. Now, after this, one of the states that would arise during this time is the Song. The Song dynasty, also known as the Northern Song, would come to unify most of China. However, there is an asterisk here because they would fail to take control of some territories that were historically part of the core of China. Territories on the northern plain itself, including the northern capital, what is now Beijing, would lie under the control of the Liao dynasty. The Xia state in western China would also hold on to core territories of what was historically part of the Tang dynasty. Now, the Song dynasty would rule over most of China for a while. However, they would eventually lose the entirety of the north after the Jurchen-ruled Jin dynasty would conquer the Liao and then later invade the Song. The Song would then flee south, where they would be able to hold on and create what is now known in history as the Southern Song dynasty. China would then once more be divided between the North and the South, and this period of North and South division would last for over 100 years. This period of North and South division would not end until the coming of Genghis Khan and the Mongol Empire. The Mongols would eventually invade the Jin dynasty and conquer it, and then after that they would invade the Song dynasty and unify China under what is known as the Yuan dynasty. Now, the Yuan dynasty would rule over a unified China for a little less than 100 years before a period of unrest would see the rise of the Red Turban Rebellion. The Red Turban Rebellion would give way to various warlords who would fight over China until the Ming dynasty would manage to conquer all of its rivals. The Ming dynasty would last for almost 300 years, beating out the time of the Tang dynasty and only second to that of the Han, and would be the last native Han dynasty to rule China. And it was also the first dynasty of the early modern era. The Ming dynasty, while they would last very long, would eventually be defeated by the Qing, and after fleeing south and holding on to some southern territories for a while, would be forced to surrender to the Qing dynasty, and which would give way to a unified Qing rule over China. Now, the Qing dynasty is a very controversial dynasty when we talk about Chinese history. Many in China blame the Qing dynasty for the problems that China faced in the modern era. Some hold that the Qing dynasty's policy actually led to China's stagnation, which allowed the West to defeat them. Now, whatever your opinion on them is, the fact is the Qing played a very important part in the history of China. It would last for almost 300 years, and during that time, it would help to shape China in many ways. China has existed as a unified entity for a decent amount of time. But when we look at all of the history of China, Chinese unification is relatively short, and China as we know today is extremely so. Not only that, but when we look at the periods of disunity, we actually see that oftentimes there was a North and South division. During multiple times in its history, you would have one or two states to rule over the North and one or two states to rule over the South. This is now outside of this, most of the kingdoms that tried to unify China failed, and even then, only a small amount of them even tried. The Sui dynasty, as mentioned before, only managed to unify China after very costly campaigns in the south. For someone who knows the history of the Eastern Roman Empire, this would be the equivalent of if Justinian's campaign in Italy had been successful and they had managed to hold on to these territories. It was very risky and costly, just that in the case of the Sui, they actually managed to do it. Now, outside of this, when we look at the various Chinese empire, only one of them have borders similar to that of modern-day China, and this is no coincidence. The Qing dynasty is the only dynasty whose borders almost matches that of the modern Chinese states. And this is because the modern idea of China in terms of a territorial claims is built on that of the Qing dynasty. When we look at the historical claims of both the People's Republic of China and the Republic of China, they claimed all the territories that fell under the Qing dynasty. This very much has to do with the Qing dynasty having brought about the concept of modern China. Now, historically, when we talk about China proper, about the Middle Kingdom, it was very different from what is often now seen as China. Now, while the concept of what China proper is did evolve over time as Chinese civilization and culture expanded, the claimed borders of the Qing dynasty can roughly be estimated to say what was historically seen as China proper, or in another way, seen as the Middle Kingdom by most Chinese states. Outside of these core territories, the varying other territories that sometimes fell under the direct rule of the Chinese states were seen simply as the lands of barbarians that had happened to come under the direct administration of the emperor. They were not seen as being Chinese proper. This, however, would not be the case for the Qing dynasty. The Qing dynasty, being a multi-ethnic empire from its start and ruled over by a relatively small population of non-Han Manchu people, viewed the concept of China very differently. For the Qing dynasty, all of their territories were seen as being part of China proper, as a part of the Middle Kingdom. All of their people were also seen as being Chinese, and they did very much to try to integrate these lands and the people into a sense of being part of China and being part of the Chinese people. We can really say that the Qing dynasty gave to us what the concept of China proper is in modern day times. Even when we look at the independent movements that arose to the end of the Qing dynasty, the Han independent movement argued for independence specifically for the 18 provinces that was ruled over by the Ming and that roughly corresponds to what was historically seen as China proper. Those who would eventually overthrow the Qing dynasty, however, and who rule modern China to this day, would take a very different approach, an approach very similar to that of the Qing themselves. The idea that all the people and all the territories as being Chinese. The historic border claims of both the People's Republic of China and the Republic of China, as I said before, aligned to the territories that were under the Qing dynasty. And when we look at the ethnic policies that the People's Republic have in place, it is for a similar reasons of some of the Qing dynasty's ethnic policies, trying to garner a sense of unified Chinese identity and a representation between all the ethnic people in China. Through this, we can see that the Qing dynasty plays a very important role of how the Chinese people view themselves and what the rulers and people both view as being part of China. Now, while we can say the Qing dynasty gives us what it means to be Chinese in a modern era and what China is in this current times, where does the sense of the need of unification come from? And what does it mean for China to be unified? We can actually see when we look through Chinese history, the concept of greater unity actually originates even before the imperial period. The earliest known records of greater unity coming from the commentary on the spring and autumn period written by a scholar during the Qi state. This concept of greater unity would also be mentioned in the writings of Confucius and Mencius, two of the greatest Chinese scholars in history. This concept of greater unity would finally take shape in the form of the Qin dynasty, which would conquer and unify the various Chinese states and then go on to form the first empire. However, while the Qin dynasty would be important to giving a shape to the greater unity, it is arguably the Han dynasty that would play the most important role in it. The Han dynasty, having lasted for over 500 years, put a very important ingrained idea about China. The ethnogenesis of the Han people themselves originate from the Han dynasty, having taken their name from the Han as I previously mentioned. The Han dynasty would rule over all the core territories of the Qin dynasty and would even slightly expand to include other territories. And during the time of the Han dynasty, the Chinese culture and civilization would continue to expand and cover all the territories of the core Chinese lands. Moving past the Han Dynasty, many dynasties that would follow would in one way or another try to stake their legitimacy going back to the Han, and this would include unifying China in order to try to position themselves as the proper successors of the previous Chinese empire. So what we can see here is that the concept of greater unity having originated in ancient Chinese history, that greater unity being given a shape under the Qin, and then that idea of greater unity being ingrained to the concept of what it means to be Chinese itself because of the Han and subsequent dynasties that used the Han for legitimacy. This concept of China would then be expanded to include various territories and people that were not historically included into it under the Qing dynasty, and the modern state of China would continue to use the Qing dynasty's claims and the Qing dynasty's idea of what it means to be China while mixing it with the ancient Chinese concept of greater unity to stake the idea of the greater unity of the state of China as we see it today. Now, my whole point in all this is to say that rather being geography or something inherent to China, it is simply politics, culture, and ethnic identity that leads to the unity of China as we see it today. There is no real reason outside of ideology to argue to or against a unified or disunified China. Now, that is not me saying that a unified China is inherently a bad thing. However, there is no inherent merit to Chinese being unified or not being unified. Various states throughout Chinese history have warred with each other for unification. While there was various wars, there were also periods of peace during the times that China spent divided. On the other hand, while there were eras of peace and prosperity during the unification, there were also bloody wars, corruption and incompetence, and finally periods of strife and collapse which led to greater wars to happen afterwards. Ultimately, a person can make a good argument for why China should be unified. They can also make an equal argument for why China should not be unified. The point I bring here is to say that it is simply a matter of ideology whether you argue for a unified China as we see today, a unified China as we see historically, or a divided China as we have also seen during various times in Chinese history. Thank you all who stuck around to the very end of this video. This is my first video. I plan on making a couple more overviews and possibly going more in depth in particular topics, both topics I've covered here and that I'll be covering in future videos.